Hi, folks. On TWiL today, Beyonce dances up a copyright storm. Mac clones are still down for the count. Lawyers occupy Wall Street. And we're overrun by foul language despite our best efforts. With Stephan, Kinsella, William Carleton, and Evan Brown next on This Week in Law.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for This Week in Law is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is TWiL, This Week in Law with Denise Howell, episode 133, recorded October 13, 2011. Beyonce, Bad Laws, and Breastaurants. This episode of This Week in Law is brought to you by Vast Conference, the ultimate in professionalism, clarity, and flexibility for your conference calls, all at a low price. For 2 Vast Conference calls free with no commitment, go to vastconference.com and use promo code TWiL. Hi, folks. It's Denise Howell here, and you have joined us here for This Week in Law, which we like to call the Webb's Law Department at your service. We've got a panel of wonderful attorneys today to talk about everything interesting that's going on in technology law, starting with Stephan Kinsella from Texas. Hi, Stephan.
Hey, Denise. Glad to be back.
It's super to have you back. We're really excited to get your thoughts on all kinds of legislation that you've been thinking about that has been happening and percolating lately, and that's going to affect us all. Also joining us is Bill Carleton from Seattle. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Denise. How are you today?
Wonderful. How are you doing?
Good, thanks.
Good. It's great to have you back on the show.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be back. Appreciate it.
Now, you're the only lawyer that I know who's been personally occupying Wall Street, so I definitely want to get into that with you shortly. And
I didn't have
Go ahead.
I didn't have the nerve to actually sleep at the park. I thought about it. My kids wanted me to do it, but my girlfriend didn't want me to do it. Anyway, I didn't do it.
Your kids are into the camping aspect.
The weather, I don't mean to trivialize the experience, but if I was going to do it, the weather while I was there was in the 80 degrees, and it was sunny, although it started raining yesterday. So, and then the kids are not allowed to put tents up, so they're sleeping under tarps that they just lay over themselves. It's kind of intense.
Well, I definitely want to hear more about that. We're glad we could catch you hard upon your return there from New York. But before we get into that and other topics, I want to welcome back to the show Evan Brown from Hinshaw and Culbertson and InternetCases.com and the great city of Chicago, Illinois. Hello.
Hey, well, thank you, Denise. It's great to be here. And, it's such a habit to say Happy Friday to you. It's a lot of fun to be mixing it up, doing this on a Thursday afternoon instead. So good to talk with you.
I know. It feels good to do the show early for some reason. I'm very excited to get into everything we have to discuss.
I have no idea what we're going to do, on Friday afternoon tomorrow. It's going to be like this liberating feeling to have the show over with.
I know, it will be, huh?
Yeah.
All right, well, someone who's not feeling terribly liberated right now, especially because there are bars and jail cell sets in the videos in question, is Beyonce Knowles, who has danced herself right into a copyright conundrum. Stephan brought this one to my attention. And if we go to Mike Masnick's site at Tech Dirt, he has a video up there that compares side by side the Beyonce video and the video of a Belgian choreographer named Anne-Therese de Kiersmaker, which have some very distinct similarities, both the choreography, the sets, etc. Clearly, this is Beyonce did do some borrowing from Anne-Therese. And the question, if you look at the bottom video that you're seeing there on your screen, it's showing the side-by-side with Beyonce and then the Belgian choreographer's video. And there's clearly some similarities. And then there are some things where some of the dance moves at the end of the roll that you just saw, if you're watching the video. These are things that appeared also in Beyonce's video, but you would think were just sort of generic dance moves, and the fact that they were in one choreographer's video wouldn't necessarily mean that they could sue about it. But when you look through the whole thing, you could see that some of the sequences were almost verbatim taken from Anna's and the sets and the costumes. And as Mike Masnick points out, once upon a time we might have called this homage. Now we call it copyright infringement, and apparently there are legal proceedings that will go after Beyonce about this. Stephan, you put this in for us. What do you think about what's going on here and what should happen? There are some generic elements, but also it's pretty clear this was more than just the sincerest form of flattery.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, Beyonce is from my hometown, my current hometown of Houston, so I have to defend her no matter what. But I watched it, and yeah, there were some elements that were similar. I don't know what your impression was or the other panelist' impression was. It wasn't identical. It wasn't a copy. But this is, I think, a natural outcome of the current copyright mentality. There's always the question that seems to come up now is, was there too much copying or was it too literal? As if the implication is, if it was a literal copy or a close copy, there would be something wrong with that. But I don't see what was wrong with that. If I remember in the YouTube video that showed the comparison, there were older scenes from decades in the past which had similar moves, which showed that even the accused copyright holder, or the copyright holder here, was doing things that she had learned from others. So, I mean, the basic idea is that copying is a way of emulating or competing or an homage, as you say. And the basic idea should be, what is wrong with copying in the first place? So I would say that it wasn't a direct copy. There probably were elements she learned from, but everyone learns from others. Nothing is in a vacuum. And this is not a new type of suit. I was looking up in my old c4sif.org posts, and there's been a host of these types of accusations over the years. There was something called the electric slide, which people do at weddings and things, and some artist was sued a couple decades ago about that by the artist of the original slide. And I think it shows that there's an incompatibility between copyright law and basically freedom, because if one person can tell other people under the guise of copyright law how they can use their bodies, then it's like a form of enslavement. I mean, you shouldn't be able to tell someone what they can do with their own body as long as they're not trespassing against other people's property.
It kind of goes to the root of what copyright law is, too, because as I understand it, reading our statute in the U.S., it has to be not just something that is expressed, but it has to be put down in a fixed form of expression. Evan, do you see any problems with this Belgian choreographer's claims along those lines?
Well, not so much of a problem formalistically, because as I understand copyright when it comes to, dancing, can you handle this, is it's actually in the choreography as it would be, written out in much the same way that a musical composition, think sheet music and, lyrics written out is subject to copyright protection in addition to the actual sound recording, sometimes in addition to the actual sound recording. So I am a little bit at a loss as to how to make much sense out of this Beyonce situation, because for one thing, it doesn't really comport with my aesthetic. It's not that I don't appreciate Beyonce. She's very talented and a lot of folks like her, but I can't have a rich enough or the ability to see into the subtleties of the choreography to make much of a comparison at all. For me, it presents the question, or it begs the question that a lot of the folks in the IRC are expressing here. Is like, wait, are you kidding? Dance moves are subject to copyright protection, and it would be interesting. I'm wondering if this, Stephan, your knowledge of the history of intellectual property law is so encyclopedic. It seems that there had to be some kind of wacky special interest at work when choreography got written into one of the forms of works protected by copyright. That seems so odd to us today. Not that dancing is unimportant or anything like that, but when we think of the type of works that are protected by copyright, the types of works that we spend the most time thinking about, literary works, graphical works, musical works, things like that. Yes, choreographic works and also pantomimes are protected by copyright. It's right there in the Copyright Act. Look it up. Did Marcel Marceau have some kind of special interest in the U.S. to lobby Congress to get pantomimes in the Copyright Act? That's what I think about this kind of stuff.
I'm actually not sure about the actual special interest legislation that got these special things in there in the beginning of the U.S. copyright law. But I think that these are, when you make up laws by legislation, it's unanticipated how they're going to affect society, especially when the internet comes online. I think there was a video, I don't know if you guys talked about it previously, but remember there was a Beyonce video, the YouTube of a little baby emulating the dance moves, right? Mm-hmm. And theoretically, that baby, I mean, Beyonce could sue her if Beyonce wanted to turn the tides on someone because the baby or the parents putting the video up were copying the moves that Beyonce had put down too. So I think that there's a lot of unanticipated consequences from making law, with a committee, a Congress or a legislature. But I don't know the actual the special interest lobbying that went on there with choreographers. But every generation or decade or two, there's another whole group asking for new protections, like the fashion industry is now trying to be included in copyright law as well. So choreographers had their say at one day.
I'm sure it was tap dancing.
Be More in IRC says that they've copyrighted Walking and we all owe royalties now. So just so you know. Bill, what do you think of all this?
I don't know that I have the eye to see exactly what move is copying what move. I think maybe I'm more of a consumer of movies or film, because graphically, the look and feel of the two videos is different. They're different palette and different. So I don't know. I'm not sure I would be confused but I just think I probably just don't have the right eye to see where the copying is. I don't know if the person bringing the choreographer bringing the complaint is complaining to get to draw attention, or if it's kind of hurt feelings that if there was a influence there, that they're not being attributed morally with some kind of acknowledgement that they were an influencer or somebody that Beyonce admires or something. Maybe that would have appeased the feelings of somebody who felt like they did something original that is being repeated. But I guess if I were a choreographer and Beyonce wanted to do some of my moves, I might be flattered, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the procedural aspects of this are kind of fascinating too, since we've got someone in Belgium trying to enforce these supposed rights against an American entertainer. Not sure how she plans to go about that. But you're right. I mean, it kind of strikes me as an episode of a potential storyline from 90210, the famous rock star, singer, dancer, getting her inspiration from some obscure but super talented choreographer. And, I'm sure it will continue to play out in that fashion. But it struck me as something worthy of discussion, because it's not, as Stephan points out, it's not the first time it's come up in the dance context. It's not even the first time it's come up in the body movement context. We had our IRC person joking about copywriting walking, but I do a kind of yoga called Bikram yoga that was invented by this controversial guy in Los Angeles named Bikram Choudhury, who who did write down his 26 postures of yoga that he, quote unquote, invented. Of course, they've been around since the days that Sanskrit was a spoken language. And he registered them with the Copyright Office. And then he proceeded to shut down the yoga studio that I used to go to all the time. Came after the owners and told them, you guys are not doing things my way. You're not paying me appropriate royalties. And, we're going to have to do something about that. And rather than, take it to the finality of litigation, they did get sued. And then I think they ultimately just caved and packed it in. And having had that happen, now, of course, that had a chilling effect on everyone else who was similarly situated. So,
did you really just say it had a chilling effect against your big yoga studio? Now it's only 95 degrees, not 105 or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, it's hard to have a chilling effect on Bikram yoga, but it did. So,
Denise, can I mention something on this?
Yes.
There's a couple of related things. There's, of course, the recent spate of lawsuits, copyright-based lawsuits against people with tattoos, especially those that appear in movies. And they have a tattoo on their face, and they're an actor. And I can't remember the particulars of this one, but there've been some where the artist that designed the original design that was put in a tattoo on someone's face sued the movie studio. Of course, they have deep pockets because they included an actor in the film with a tattoo. And I think the solution was to blur out the tattoo or use special effects to change it, which is, in my view, ridiculous. And then trademark also enters into this. I believe there was a case a few years ago where one of the pro wrestlers, I don't remember the details because I'm not a big pro wrestling fan, but he had some trademark move. He holds his hand up in a certain way, and he was actually suing people for using that hand gesture. And on the attribution front, it seems to me that if Beyonce and people like that weren't afraid of being sued for copyright infringement and shaken down for royalty payments, they wouldn't be afraid to give attribution to people whose influence they learned from or who they borrowed from. But it could be that there's no attribution because they're afraid it would be an admission that could get them, liability.
So this may be a bit far afield, but over in IRC, He Synergy wanted us to check out Laban movement analysis, something created by Rudolf Laban, which is a way and language for interpreting, describing, visualizing, and notating all ways of human movement. I guess that's a way of putting movement into a fixed form, just to make the lawyers who want to pursue such claims happier if they were to espouse Laban movement analysis. So thanks for giving us that. The IRC, by the way, is going crazy with our discussion here, saying, this just shows why lawyers are the worst scum of the earth. And, we generally tend to agree with you all on that front, and we try to be as unscummy as possible. And Bill actually has been being about as unscummy as any lawyer I know right now, because, lawyers get this, we're frequently cliched, classed in with sharks or called sharks. And I was thinking before the show this morning that actually is kind of inaccurate, because we're really more the remora glomming on to the sharks of other people's business, at least on the business lawyer side.
Suckerfish.
Exactly. That's probably a more accurate description. But Bill picked up and left Seattle, where he lives, and went out to New York because he was so taken by these Occupy Wall Street demonstrations. He wanted to go and participate and see for himself what was going on there. And he just got back last night. And Bill, why don't you fill us in? I live in Orange County, California, which we here sort of humorously call behind the orange curtain, and I guarantee you very little is getting occupied here. So, although maybe it should be. So, why don't you tell us what's going on?
Well, it's a very savvy occupation. I guess I'll use the word that the movement, the way they describe themselves. You could call it an act of civil disobedience. You could call it performance art. You could call it consciousness raising. The first couple of weeks there was a lot of chatter and complaining that the media is not covering this. I went there Sunday night and attended the General Assembly's Sunday night through Tuesday and kind of hung out at the park for parts of 4 days. There's plenty of media attention on it now. So, as a strategy, it seems to really be working. The camera crews and the reporters there are not just mostly, I'd say half of them are from other countries. They're Al Jazeera correspondents and Japanese and Chinese news crews, and all kinds of just almost every corner people being interviewed. But the life of the community is governed by this concept called the General Assembly that meets every night at 7, and it's this open forum where the logistics of the occupation of Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan, just a block up from Wall Street, are discussed, and it's all process. The meetings even get into whether the people chosen to be facilitators that evening, whether anybody objects to them being facilitators. And they go through things like committee reports and how money is being spent, and concerns about safety and cleanliness in the park, logistical planning for the next marches, and it's all about process. In terms of messaging, even at the General Assemblies, some of the rules include that you're not supposed to express your personal political opinions, that those are reserved for different times or different formats. And the organizers even make a point of distinguishing between their personal stories, their personal motivations for being there, and their personal politics and the movement itself, which I don't know. I feel it's very powerful. I found the human microphone aspect of how information is disseminated to be really very moving, and I admire what's going on. I admire what they're doing, and it seems to be, from what I can tell, it seems to be really, really effective in getting people to think. On the Millionaires March that took place, was that Tuesday? I'm losing track. It was I think it was Tuesday. And it was only a few hundred people. The Guardian had a really objective, good story of that. And it was an event that was organized by a local activist group that preceded the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I think they were happy to have the Occupy Wall Street movement join them because it brought a whole ton of media coverage. But I noticed as the people were marching up Park Avenue, the workers, people working on scaffolding and on the street, and the doormen were taking flyers and chatting with the people and not being derisive or dismissive. I also felt, and I wasn't there when they had a big march, and I've seen the videos of the young women who were pepper sprayed, and seen instances on YouTube of things that went wrong. But just speaking from my experience of the last 4 days, I don't even think the cops are antagonistic. The few I interacted with and the ones I saw there over the last 4 days are polite and even respectful. So I don't know. I'm rambling at this point. It's an experiment in direct democracy. I think, to me, if I had to summarize, I'd say the message was so much of what government does and what business does and what banks and finance and the system, I guess you could say, does is occupies our attention, occupies our mind space, and normal people don't have a seat in the process, and they just sort of say, we're going to take our seat here. We're going to be here. We're going to sit in. We're going to be around, and you're going to have to deal with us at some point.
And you told us there was actually a legal twist to all of this that you found pretty interesting, having to do, we were discussing this right before the show, Evan and I, with the fact, I think, that this is private property, Zuccotti Park, where most of this is happening.
Yeah. It's I guess maybe it's common in a lot of cities, but New York has these public-private spaces. I'm not an expert on this, but the idea would be when a developer wants to build a grand new structure, part of the concessions they might give, maybe in exchange for an extra height allowance or some zoning variance, would be to establish space within the developed property that would be open to the general public. And Zuccotti Park, formerly known as Liberty Park, it's in a very significant space in civic terms, it's about a couple blocks from the World Trade Center site, and it's just a block up from Trinity Church and across the street, Trinity Church, then across the street from Wall Street. It's sort of situated in a very historic part of the country, and the owner of the building that was developed there, had to dedicate the park for public use, and it's in this kind of zone where it's not entirely a public park, but it's subject to, like, for one thing, I think one of the rules being broken is that people shouldn't be camping there, technically. The mayor is being very deft in how he's handling what's going on, because he's being accommodating, because New York's a big city, and they're a world-class city, and they're used to this kind of thing, but he's being dismissive at the same time. He kind of walks that fine line to be able to pull that off. And they're doing things to actively discourage or make it more difficult, one of them being the ordinance against people aren't supposed to be camping there, so there's an ordinance against tents, and they're not letting the kids erect tents in the space, but I think they're allowing them to sleep there under the notion that they're not technically violating things by not setting up tents. Similarly, there's a ordinance against use of amplification or bullhorns in public spaces, and that's something that's been written a lot about by people, that may be a little bit of urban legend, but that restriction has led to the phenomenon of this human microphone, which Occupy movements in other cities which don't have the restrictive amplification ordinances are adopting almost as a kind of an ethos or a method or a philosophy of how the General Assemblies ought to work. The idea, because of the limit of not being able to amplify your voice, because you have hundreds, perhaps thousands circled around the platform, which they call the stack, for whoever has the floor and is speaking, lacking amplification, the people surrounding the speaker repeat what the speaker says, and then the next wave back of them repeats that, so the message cascades out in little phrases or snippets. It's right. An interesting way of...
There's some video of this and some, I'd say, a pretty snarky kind of oriented post over on Huffington Post saying that, this human microphone is kind of a brilliant innovation, but not working so well, and that people who are trying to make jokes and humorous comments in their addressing the crowd are finding that it gets lost in the translation as someone tries to yell very loud what they have just said. Do you think that it worked okay, or what was your experience with it?
My experience of it was different. I thought it worked really well. And one of the links you put up on the show notes I read this morning, it talked about how it's not possible to get a good intonation with the human microphone, that you lose some of that. And I felt just the opposite. Here's an example I want to give you. I'm looking for it because I wrote it down on my blog the other day. This was my favorite. This is one of my favorites. And in this particular sequence, the human microphone was on 2x generation. So they decide, the organizers decide, depending on the size of the crowd at the moment, how many times what the originating person says should be repeated. It might be a 1x, it might be a 2x, it might be a 3x. This particular evening, the first evening I was there, it was a 2x generation. And I'm just going to redo it here, read aloud, and try to match the intonation. The sentence went like this: if you have an expenditure, then the next group says, if you had an expenditure, and the third group said, if you have an expenditure, and I'll just keep going, over $100, over $100, over $100. Please talk to finance. Please talk to finance. Please talk to finance before spending the money. Before spending the money, before spending the money. And I thought that was that intonation did get through. The repeaters were faithful to it, appreciated the humor in it. I thought it was moving, and it was effective, because by being part of the it's inviting by being almost like being in church and having a call and response or a responsive prayer. By participating in what's being said, you aren't necessarily endorsing it, but you're acknowledging what's being said, you're listening to it, and you're passing it along and sharing it to those around you. So I thought it was a manifestation of the participatory ethos of the whole event, the whole movement.
And it's sort of a parallel to something we talk about a lot on This Week in Law, that if there's a workaround to something that is a legal barrier, folks will find it. And it may not be the most perfect workaround, but it's going to work for them. Stephan, any thoughts on what's going on here, including we have a link in here about Anonymous and they're jumping on the Occupy Wall Street bandwagon and threatening to shut down NYSE-type sites. I don't believe that sort of thing has happened yet, but you never want to count these guys out. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think what Bill mentioned was interesting. One interesting thing about it was, in the uprisings in the Middle East, et cetera, in Asia, they have been using high tech to get around government regulations, Twitter and Facebook and email and text messaging. And in one of the most high-tech countries in the world, we're using a low-tech way to get around it. I almost wonder if someone's going to come up with a simple Android or iPhone app that lets you do what we used to do on CB radios or walkie-talkies, and have a guy just speaking to his microphone and everyone in the vicinity hear it on their cell phone or something instead of this low-tech way. But
oh wow, the Occupy app.
Right, the Occupy app or something like that. I'm curious how the ordinance applies if the park is private property. I assume you seem like the private owners could allow amplification if they wanted to. It may be the ordinance trumps private property rights. I don't know. But I think the Occupy Wall Street movement, I don't know if you've seen, there's a Venn diagram going around trying to, in simplistic terms, show the Tea Party versus the OWS movement and show that the Tea Party is basically against government control, which is not true, I think, because you'll hear Tea Partiers say, I want the government to keep their cotton-picking hands off my Social Security payments. And it's like, well, that comes from the government. And then they say that the OWS are against corporatocracy or corporate power, and the overlap would be crony capitalism, or the interface between capitalism or abusive capitalism or capitalism run amok and the state, which I think is actually true. I think the OWS people are sensing something that's wrong. They don't quite have the right analysis of the disease that's giving rise to the symptoms, which is the state and its intermixing with the economy, its regulations. And the bailout of Wall Street was done by the state. Sure, it was done at the behest of Wall Street companies, just like welfare recipients will come to the trough if you put benefits out. But to ask the state to fix a problem that the state has caused, I think they're missing some of the analysis. But it is good, I think, that they are organizing on their own. And in fact, what they're doing shows that you don't always need the state. If they're organizing independently, it shows the stateless model or the free society model can work without state intervention, and that they're trying to keep people to channel their political views instead of using it as a platform on their own. I've seen some YouTube videos of some Austrian economics-oriented and educated people at OWS. There's a young guy who was talking about Ron Paul and the problems with the Fed and the problems with crony capitalism, who was very informed and literate. And hopefully there's a lot of discussions among the people there of different flavors, Tea Party, right-wingers, left-wingers, people that are just hostile to something they sense as a significant, institutional unfairness that's going on.
Yeah,
well, I don't. Stephan, you had to be old enough to remember CB radios to have come up with your brilliant idea there. I think that ZJ Driver is going to go out and start coding right now. And Beatmaster in IRC points out the rich, wonderful irony of using the products of Apple and Google in the form of the smartphones and the infrastructure of AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile to facilitate the protests against large corporations.
Yeah, there's actually a debate going on now in libertarian circles, of which I'm a part, between the sort of regular libertarians and the left libertarians. Some of the left libertarians have said that there's a diagram going around, or a picture that's been doctored up to show that all the protesters are using these products. And some of the left libertarians say that's an unfair criticism, just like it's unfair of people that are more in favor of state interventions to criticize us when we use public roads, et cetera, because we have no choice. And if the criticism of crony capitalism is correct, then the reason that corporations dominate the provision of all these goods and services is because of a sort of unholy alliance between the state and corporations. I don't completely myself agree with that criticism, but there's something a little bit too easy about that criticism of people for using what's available in society, whether it's state provided or crony capitalism provided or private sector provided.
Right. And I don't think it's the point of any of the people involved in these demonstrations to chuck their iPhones or Android phones on the fire and say, you know, we are renouncing the product of these corporations. I think that they want them to run differently. Bill, is that about right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And picking up on something Stephen said before about he hoped there was there were a lot of dialogues going on in the park about, you know, people's personal political views. There definitely were. There were libertarians there. There were Ron Paul supporters there. There were anarchists there. There were socialists there. There were all kinds of people there. But the movement itself, you know, and this will be the success of it if it's going to sustain itself, is aggressively. It's kind of weird to say, is aggressively nonpartisan. The General Assemblies are not supposed to. People are not supposed to be soapboxing and airing their personal political views. In terms of, not to be a propagandist, but in terms of the messaging, you know, in the this is kind of fun. There's a publication called the Occupied Wall Street Journal talk about trademark or copyright infringement, but because the font
down to
and
the
everything
fonts.
is
Yeah.
But I really, really like this bit as a piece of writing. It's an editorial about trying to explain what people can't understand about why there's no list of demands. And this part says, talks about how the politicians are trying to race to the front of the line and get in front of the movement. And they're right, but how can they run out in front of something that is in front of them? They cannot. For Wall Street and Washington, the demand is not on them to give us something that isn't theirs to give. It's ours. It's on us. We aren't going anywhere. We just got here. And I think people are just kind of coming with their smartphones and their good educations. I saw one article ridiculing some of the protesters because they were from Ivy League schools that were there, and that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Why kids with a good education wouldn't necessarily put that critical thinking and that education to good use. But yeah, there are ironies. In one of the meetings, they were talking about the problem of people on the committee making expenditures in the name of the committee. They weren't authorized, as in that quote I said later, and then they were instituting a policy of people, if they had expenditures over $100, they were to come to the finance working group and get prepaid debit cards. So there's no little amount of irony there. That's probably a financial product that that the Wall Street financiers are taking their cut on each one of those credit cards.
Evan, maybe Beyonce will head out there and start leading the protesters in an original dance or two.
Yeah, I hope so. You know, there needs to be something to make it more evocative, I guess. You know, my problem with this is that fundamental dissonance that we've been talking about here, the fact that they're using these corporate products, you know, these products, that the protesters are the beneficiaries of these corporate endeavors, and you know, a motif that I see through, you know, the IRC and hear other people talking about is, you know, the corporations aren't inherently evil. It's just that the way that the power is balanced in all of this stuff in the situation right now might be a little bit out of whack. And so I certainly don't have anything deep or insightful to say about this, on the political layer. It's not a political show. We're not really here to talk about political stuff anyway. The only thing I really have to say about this is I really hope that the creators of South Park give treatment to the concept of the human microphone. I think Matt Stone and Trey Parker could do some really wonderful stuff with Stan Marsh's dad leading one of those things. That's just made for fun.
But not the human centipede, hopefully.
That's an awesome.
Yeah.
Maybe
That's
a
an
mashup
awesome
of
idea.
the two.
Yeah, there we go. I thought they did something about the human centipede. If I couldn't remember, but we'll leave it to them to figure something out.
Well, we're here today with Evan Brown, who's just been speaking, and Stephan Kinsella and William Carleton. And we've got lots more to discuss, including updates about OnStar, SciStar, foul language, and Breastaurants. But before we get to any of that, I want to thank our sponsor for this episode of This Week in Law, which is VAST Conference. This show is brought to you by VAST Conference, and if you're like most of us, you want to be professional in every aspect of your business. And when you think about it, professionalism begins with those all-important conference calls and with clients and colleagues. What makes a conference call professional? Well, you need a dial-in number you can give out for calls at a moment's notice. You need clear connections for when you and your call participants dial in. The popping and delays that you can get from voice over IP can be embarrassing and irritating. And for large calls, you need the ability to manage call participants online. So VAST Conference has put this all together for you in a professional, affordable, and advanced package. It enables you to quickly connect 2 or more callers on the phone. You can have up to 300 callers at once, even though most conference calls have 3 to 5 participants, so you can see the flexibility that VAST Conference offers you. They give you both a regular dial-in number and a toll-free number, and you use these to set up calls at any time. VAST calls are clear because they use fiber optic lines and high-end teleconferencing equipment, something you don't get from voice over IP. VAST includes a well-designed conference call management interface, which you can access on their website to manage users and callers. And for large calls, you can have question and answer sessions. You can record any call instantly as an MP3 file with no special equipment. And you can access detailed usage tracking and billing codes for internal accounting. VAST also comes with a friendly, enthusiastic customer service team. They call it above and beyond customer service. And the pricing for this professional conference service is low, and it's pay as you go. You pay 2.5 cents a minute for regular toll calls and 6 cents a minute for 800 number calls. And you decide which number you're going to give out to your call participants. Sign up is fast and easy, and there are no commitments or contracts. You pay only for the calls you host. And for our audience, we have an exclusive. You can have 2 business calls for free, up to 300 minutes, to give you a chance to try out the service. So to take advantage, please go to vastconference.com and sign up for a free account. It's fast and easy, and they'll give you a regular toll number and a regular toll-free number, so you can start using your numbers for calls right away. Be sure to use the promo code TWiL, T-W-I-L, to get your 2 business calls for free. That's vastconference.com, promo code TWiL. Thank you so much, VAST Conference, for your support of This Week in Law. So a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about OnStar and how they took a bunch of flack for keeping records on folks using their service after they were no longer actually signed up for the service. Lots of privacy issues there. And this is a situation where now please excuse the bad pun since we're talking about motor vehicles, where the squeaky wheel actually got the grease. People complaining led to congressional pressure, and ultimately OnStar decided to do away with the technology that was leading to this privacy concern. So I just wanted to update folks on that, since we did talk about it when it was an open issue. Now they've actually reversed what's going on and closed that privacy hole. Anybody have any quick comments on that before we move on? Evan?
They really have egg on their face about this one. You know, one of their PR people said that, one of OnStar's PR people said the reason we wanted to do this was to alert people, what was it, if there were product recalls or natural disasters. Now, why do you need to keep tracking people where their locations, perpetually to do that? I would believe them more if they were going to do something really beneficent like, track down your stolen vehicle. But that's, I guess what one of the main purposes of OnStar is for anyway. So it looked pretty unjustifiable, this privacy misstep that they made on this one. So I'm glad they changed their mind.
It seems like something that they maybe just were not even quite aware was happening, and that someone caught it. And once it was brought to their attention, they did the right thing. Stephan, any thoughts?
No, I agree with Evan, and I do think it was a misstep. But I think it shows how even when companies, even large ones like this, make mistakes, there can be feedback, and they can change their policies relatively quickly. By contrast, the governmental agencies that some people were calling for to step in and regulate OnStar here have been collecting data for decades or longer. And these things change glacially slowly, and I think that the collections of data by the about the feds, it's a much bigger threat to your civil liberties and your privacy than some company like this. So I think it's good that market pressure can be brought to bear. They need to be exposed, but at least they can change, and there's competition and alternatives in cases where they don't respond quickly enough.
Yep, I think that's right. How about you, Bill? Any thoughts on OnStar?
Yeah, I see it in terms of in user-generated content terms. To me, it's structurally pretty much the same thing as Facebook monetizing user posts or Twitter putting ads on the back of user activity. It almost brings you to the point where you want to ask the question, because obviously OnStar is valuing the information enough that they want to continue to maybe not spend a lot of money because they already have the installation, but they want to manage that information even when a person doesn't want to be a customer anymore and presumably isn't paying them anymore. So it raises for me the question of what are the economics and what's the price point at which maybe users should say, what will you pay me to be exposed to the information or to give you the content I have to give you or to allow you to track me? Obviously that data, OnStar saw it as valuable for purposes that didn't have to do with serving the particular customer that had already terminated.
Yep, I agree, and that's reminiscent of what Doc Searles and the vendor relationship management folks have been working on for years, and they're starting to get a bit more attention as well, which is a good thing. So we talked about OnStar. Let's talk about SciStar. This is the company that was putting Mac OS X on their own hardware, and they have been wending their way through the court system unsuccessfully for some time. And I think their lack of success has now reached finality. Evan, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is an Apple story that in large part flew under the radar with so much other Apple stuff happening in the last few weeks, last 2 or 3 weeks, with the release of the iPhone 4S and, of course, Steve Jobs passing away. So if you'll remember a few years ago, it was a big deal when SciStar released its line of hardware that would run, Mac OS X on it. And so what Apple did was sued for a number of things: trademark infringement, unfair competition, and importantly, copyright infringement, saying that loading the Mac operating system onto this hardware was an infringement because it was outside of the scope of the license agreement for the operating system. And SciStar raised as a defense the idea that this is copyright misuse. And copyright misuse is a doctrine that essentially says a copyright holder cannot use copyright law to enforce rights that are really outside of the scope of that copyright and what the copyright is intended to protect, namely, the exclusive rights to make copies, so that it hinders the development of competing products. In this case, SciStar lost at the trial court level, and it went up to appeal in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals out there in California, and SciStar lost there as well. The court affirming the lower court's holding that Apple's requirement, or Apple's filing suit over this copyright infringement, was not an instance of copyright misuse, because Apple's requirement that the operating system only be used on Apple's hardware did not stifle or somehow discourage the development of competing products, because SciStar was free to develop its own hardware and its new software. What SciStar was trying to do was its own hardware with Apple's software. And so the court held that copyright misuse defense did not work. So the net result, the net effect of that is the license agreement for that Apple has, requiring that the software be used only in connection on certain hardware, is valid and enforceable. And so that certainly ties up, it secures the closed system that we have come to expect from Cupertino.
Right, and Dark in IRC just put the comment, and you were saying it ties up the closed system. He put the comment in IRC that it's tying, presumably from an antitrust standpoint, which is what Microsoft got in so much trouble for with IE. I think in the case of Apple, they pretty much are able to skirt that because of their lack of market dominance on the personal computer marketplace. Bill, any thoughts on this?
I'm looking at the chatter too, and somebody made the remark about a lot of our personal life is in the computers, and I wonder if they're thinking in terms of data being captured on a proprietary box. I mean, I don't know if I see that, because one, I know there are implications too if you're going to put your data up in the cloud somewhere, or I guess you could put it on remote storage. No, I mean, I read Evan's post. I thought it was good, and I think it was the Evan, correct me if I'm misreading this, but I thought it was kind of the Ninth Circuit checking back in on a fundamental point and saying no changes there. That's they're not going to let copyright abuse be used in that way to upset Apple's apple cart. Sorry, that was a bad one.
Yeah, you said it. You went right ahead and said it. You're right, Bill. That's there's really nothing new. We don't learn something new and revolutionary about copyright law and that doctrine of copyright misuse in all of this. What it does do for us is place it within, culturally a very intriguing context, because of, and the reason that it's so culturally intriguing is because of the ecosystem that really didn't pertain to the facts of the case. I mean, what they were dealing here was, the OS X, the operating system, on the laptop or whatever, not the mobile environment, but it does translate well into the closed system that is the App Store, and that those tight restrictions that Apple does put, ensuring that the hardware only runs certain software, and that the software is only on certain hardware. I mean, I just said the same thing twice, right? But that's what makes this so intriguing and so noteworthy, is because of the cultural significance it has to us in these products that we come to love so enthusiastically.
Right. The tying argument could be made a lot more forcefully in the mobile arena, where Apple and the iPhone is so dominant. Stephan, any thoughts about tying up your operating system and not making it available for other pieces of hardware, either contractually or using copyright?
Yeah, in the SciStore case, I think when you ask people, what do you think about this result? They're thinking, was it right? Was it just? Was it fair? And that's because they have this old-fashioned mentality or conception of courts as deciding disputes between people and trying to come up with the just result, which is sort of the common law idea or the way law used to be made or formed. But when you have law predominated by arbitrary legislative statutes like the antitrust law and the patent law and the copyright law, the judge's job, I wish I could find the quote. There's a great quote from around 1890 by this guy who was opposing the codification of New York's law. And he said, you know, that the judge's traditional search for justice has been replaced, this sort of manly search for justice has been replaced by the mere pedestrian task of trying to interpret words, whether the result would be just or not. I think judges are sometimes in a difficult, there's sometimes no right answer, because what you have is you have the antitrust laws, which the state imposes to try to ostensibly limit the ability of private actors to acquire monopoly power. And at the same time, the state hands out monopoly grants of privilege in the form of copyright and patent. So the courts can only say there's a tension between these laws, and they have to, I don't know, flip a coin or make a decision. My sense is that the judge here probably decided correctly. Once you grant copyrights, then you're going to have this. I think it's unfortunate, but you really can't blame Apple for using the legal rights that the state gives it. It leads to an interesting question, which I blogged about a month or two ago on the Mises blog, about comparing whether Apple or Microsoft, which one benefited more in its current success from state IP law. And I think it's pretty clear Microsoft has, because they're a software-dominated company. But Apple used to be, at least until fairly recently, a hardware company. They were selling good hardware. And just like Mercedes can sell nice hardware at a premium if it's at a higher price but higher quality, Apple could too. So I do think Apple has benefited from cases like this, but I don't know if their success is essentially dependent on it. I know my first computer in 1984 was a Franklin Ace Apple II Plus clone. And soon after that was a famous case. Apple sued Franklin and got them shut down and prevented them from competing. And this SciStar case is just the modern version of that. So Apple is benefited to some extent by these laws. I don't think their success is dependent on it. I don't think their closed system would look identical if they couldn't rely so much on copyright and patent law. On the other hand, Apple's at the receiving end of a lot of patent lawsuits too. Sometimes retaliatory from Android manufacturers and sometimes from patent trolls.
Let's check in with what's been going on in Washington recently. We have talked about the signing into law of the American Invents Act and how folks were variously disappointed with the law. You have, Stephan, done a great webinar on this, and Evan has convinced me that I need to sit down and make my way through it, which I haven't done yet. He has, and says it's just phenomenal. So in a nutshell, can you give us your take on America Invents?
Sure. Patent reform is always talked about, just like I've probably heard for 10 or 15 years now that the government is going to get rid of the marriage penalty. And so my wife and I haven't legally filed for divorce to get that tax break, waiting for this penalty to be erased. And of course, it never happens. So they dangle a carrot of reform out in front of you for a long time. Patent reform is the same way. You hear talk all the time about patent reform, but the organized patent bar and the technical industries that rely upon patents always manage to keep the debate within very small parameters, where if you propose any significant reform, then it's called radical and crazy and wacko. So all the reform that's really realistic that's talked about is always pretty minor and on the edges. And it's been the current bill that was passed about a month ago, the American Invents Act, has been pending for 6 or 7 years, and of course special interest groups batted it back and forth. Now the received wisdom from the patent bar is that the big change is that we switched from the first to invent priority rule for patents to a first to file rule, which I think all of the rest of the world has. And the U.S. since the beginning, or almost since the beginning, has had a first to invent rule. And we've changed. And, you know, the received wisdom is that that's the big change wrought by this law. And some people argue that it benefits big companies over small ones. My understanding, there's only like about 70 cases a year of independent invention of where you have conflicting patent applications, like two people file a patent simultaneously or relatively simultaneously for the same idea because they independently invented. And then they had to have an interference proceeding to determine which one conceived of the idea first. Because in the U.S., if you could show that you invented it first, you could win, even if you filed it later. Well, they've gone to a simpler system where the guy that files first will now win in those cases. But I don't think it's a big change at all, except in a few marginal cases. I mean, 70 cases out of maybe 200, 300, 400,000 filings is not a very big number. And it doesn't really make a difference to the victims of patents, to the victims of patent trolls or patent aggressors or patent monopolists. I'd say the biggest positive change was the addition of a general prior commercial user defense, which never existed before. Before 1998, there was no defense at all. In 98, there was a narrow defense added for business method users who were prior users. They were grandfathered in. Now that's been broadened inexplicably to me because it's actually going to weaken the power of patent aggressors to sue people who've been using an idea for a while but never bothered to patent it. So that's the biggest improvement. But I think it's there's a lot that are inside baseball that are not that interesting and that are not that big deals. Patent lawyers are going to have to learn the new rules, and of course they're getting a lot of business now because of this. The bad changes are that the best mode requirement has been almost abolished, as has the penalty for false marking. The best mode requirement was one of the 3 requirements you had to satisfy to obtain a patent. You have to give a written description, has to be enabling, that is, teach someone how to use it or make it, and it had to disclose your best mode, so you couldn't keep your best way of doing it a trade secret but still get a patent claim that covered it, because that violates the patent bargain that you disclose everything to the public in exchange for a temporary monopoly. Well, Congress has almost inexplicably gotten rid of that. The penalties for best mode, if you fail to disclose best mode, is still technically required, but there's no penalty if you don't disclose it, so it's really not a requirement anymore. False marking was this antitrust intersection we talked about earlier, where if you claim to have a patent on a product that is not patented, it's potentially like an antitrust abuse because you're assuming a monopoly. You're basically scaring off competition even though you don't have a legal monopoly of patent. That has almost been eradicated by this law. And there's some bizarre special interest provisions in there, like the dog ate my homework rule provision, which I think I forgot the name of there's a famous law firm in the Northeast and a big biotech firm that there's a provision in the law that allows you to extend the term of your patent if you are delayed by the FDA regulations when you get your pharmaceutical approved. And you have to apply for this, apparently. I'm not a biotech lawyer, so I don't know how it works, but you have to apply. And some law firm missed the filing date by a few days. And so this patent on this very lucrative drug was going to expire earlier than it would have if they had obtained the FDA delay. And so for years, this law firm and their client has been lobbying Congress to patch the law to basically give them a second bite at the apple. And they did it in this law. And it saves this law firm from hundreds of millions of dollars in a malpractice lawsuit and the company. So that provision, the law was changed basically to save, apparently, at the lobbying of one law firm and its client, or former client maybe. So that's the bottom line of the AI. Sorry, go ahead.
Stephen, I think the law firm was Wilmer Hale.
I think it was, yeah.
Something like a couple $100 million they were facing.
Yep, you're right.
Well, now that we know the state of patent law in the wake of the Invents Act, I think it's worth pointing out, Cory Doctorow had a great post over on Boing Boing where he caught that Francis Gurry, the Director General of the UN's World Intellectual Property Organization, fondly known as WIPO, got up and said that he thought that the web would be much better off if it were all locked up in patents and if every user of the web needed to pay a license fee to use it. So there's a vision of a future for you all to ponder for a moment. Evan, did you take a look at this?
I did, and I don't know if I should dare say anything because Stephan Kinsella is in this conversation as well, and if he were to just address this, I think that there might be a small nuclear fusion kind of reaction because of the absurdity of
I noticed he didn't identify the inventor of the internet in that comment. Is it DARPA? Who's the inventor supposed to be?
I don't know, but also speaking with him at the same table was the now head of CERN, so maybe that would have prompted some kind of recognition of Tim Berners-Lee.
I think it was the same guy who got sued for infringing the copyright in the Macarena from the 1996 Democratic National Convention. There you go.
Yes. Absolutely. All right. Well, from the absurd to the more absurd, probably the reason I most want to talk about this story about trademark and the word tweet and Twitter is because that the writer for the Wall Street Journal, Justin Sheck, just could not contain himself from making pun after pun. The headline is foul, F-O-W-L language. Companies squawk about who gets tweet. And the article goes on in that vein throughout, mostly just pointing out that it's sort of funny and Schadenfreude-esque, I guess, to note that although the term tweet is used quite frequently with reference to Twitter, Twitter did not rush in and trademark that term, and some of its API partners did. So it doesn't have the registered trademark in tweet for this purpose, and it's trying without that to go around squashing various uses of the term. Stephan, what do you think of this?
Well, I don't know if this pun will be received, but I think people that make those kind of puns are dinosaurs.
Ha 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 ha. Yes, with this geeky audience, I think we
yeah, my 8-year-old taught me that.
Yeah.
It's of course absurd, and but it's just one of many examples of lots of outrageous uses of trademark. You know, we most of us focus on the abuses that are obviously perceivable with copyright and patent abuse, because these are basically just monopolies granted. But we mostly have a warm spot for trademark because you think this is a formalized way of stopping consumer fraud. But I think it's in cases where trademark law is applied to cases like this, where there's no colorable claim of fraud. I mean, who's being really confused or defrauded by this? That I think it's trademark law can also be very abusive when it's applied to cases other than consumer confusion or fraud.
Yeah, just pointing out the absurdity of the law that you're getting at, Stephan. In the article, there's the paragraph, birdhouse makers are probably in the clear when it comes to tweet, says J. Thomas McCarthy, a professor at University of San Francisco Law School, who wrote a multi-volume treatise on trademark law, since consumers are unlikely to confuse birdhouses with online messaging services. If we truly need a law professor to enunciate that, I think we've gotten to a really bad place. What do you think, Bill?
I like the article. I like the attitude of it, and I like the puns and the inside jokes. When I was in, it reminds me of a headline. I was on the staff of my college newspaper, and the government department at the school had some forum on what was the movement, the Solidarity movement in Poland, and some of us kids thought it was ironic that two of the professors that were being brought back to campus to speak on the topic had not received tenure and had left the college in the last couple of years. So we came up with the line that this was our headline. It's just awful, but we were having so much fun laughing at it. We went with it. It was punted profs pool Polish perspectives. So
wow.
That's what that headline made me think of. You know, this happens a fair bit, right, with some of the social media companies. They want to be ubiquitous and open, and they have a certain initial idealism, and then as they get around to thinking more seriously about how they're trying to monetize and maybe even change their business model to take more control, being less of an open platform, more proprietary, kind of after the fact, they want to retrade back and claim rights that maybe have already kind of left the barn.
Flown the coop.
Thank you, Evan.
Everyone's got a bad pun in today.
Beat me to that one. Evan, any thoughts on tweet?
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about you've got to ask a law professor about this. You know, we've gone too far. It's not just any law professor. You know, McCarthy on trademarks. You know, for those who practice trademark law, I mean, it's like consulting the oracle. You know, of all things knowledge when it comes to trademarks. So, yeah, the real problem here is kind of the fundamental issue of what a trademark does. It serves to identify the source of the goods or services, and you know, oftentimes that's thought of as property, erroneously thought of as property that's owned by the company, the provider of those goods and services. But really, it's more of a consumer protection kind of thing. And so it's that whole weirdness right there, or that strangeness, is illustrated by what happens when something that really probably arose. I don't know if there's a factual dispute over this, but the word tweet arose in the nomenclature of the user base. And so why is it that Twitter, or how is it really that Twitter could claim exclusive rights to that? And it's something that's fun to talk about and fun to think about. And I guess we also need to acknowledge, that that some of the lawyers inside Twitter are friends of the show. So it'd be interesting to see what Alex McGillivray was really thinking about this stuff. We would never find that out. But that's the weirdness about it all, is how it's such a user-based type of word, and how that relates to trademark law underscores that kind of aspect of this whole protection scheme.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see if terms of service for social sites, which the terms of service for Twitter, at least when they initially came out of the coop, were very minimal. They have since gotten more standard, but it'd be interesting to see, if they're addressing that issue, that if you users invent some term that describes our service and it becomes ubiquitous and important to the way we function and market ourselves, then we own that. I don't know exactly how you'd phrase that, but
I don't think that would work, because that would be a trademark assignment or a trademark license, and there can't be any such license under trademark law without and also assigning the goodwill that's associated with that mark. And how can the user base really have that goodwill in the first place if that goodwill isn't also assigned? It's a naked license, and it's unenforceable.
Denise, let me mention something here too. The one problem with the consumer confusion analysis is that since 1995, if I recall, we had the anti-dilution right added to trademark law, which has really nothing to do with consumer protection or consumer confusion. So even if there's no consumer confusion shown or even possible, Twitter could argue that someone else's use of tweet tarnishes their trademark in tweet. Although if I recall in this case, I think that someone else has applied for it and Twitter is battling them. So they've probably been advised by their attorneys, you have to protect this mark. Otherwise you might not be able to keep using it by some competitor or trademark troll, I guess you want to call them now.
Right. We are definitely in need of having our friend Marty Schwimmer back on the show to go deep on some of these trademark issues, because we've had a lot of them come up lately. But this one is an interesting and kind of a fun one to think about. Also interesting and fun to think about is the fact that Hooters is not real happy with competitive restaurant Twin Peaks. Stephan, this is from your site. Why don't you bring us up to speed?
Well, yeah, I think this is a trade secret case now. So we've covered now all the main four types of IP. I think an executive there's a competing restaurant chain called Twin Peaks, which competes with Hooters. They both have scantily clad waitresses, etc. And I think some of the executives of Hooters left to join Twin Peaks. And one of the allegations is a fairly legitimate type of trade secret claim that, they stole some procedural documents about how to run the company, something like this. But I think other elements of it appear to be trademark oriented, or I don't know, copyright look and feel that.
Oh God, no! You didn't just say that.
Inadvertent. So this is another example of companies trying to compete by using, the state's legal system instead of just competing by providing a better service.
Right. So look and feel, Breastaurant, there's all kinds of good in this post of yours here. Evan, do you think that I mean, it seems like a pretty standard trade secret case, aside from all the window dressing that you've got. Some executives bringing some supposedly specialized knowledge of business function and techniques to a competitor. Any further gloss you can add to this?
Other than things appear to be stacked against them, so they really need to double up on their defense. We see this in other industries as well. HP's involved in litigation like this all the time. When executives leave one company and go to another, I mean, trade secret litigation is no stranger to the court system, and it happens, quite a bit at those high levels. There's this, and it's kind of muddied by this doctrine of inevitable disclosure. There will be trade secret misappropriation because the job that the guy will be doing at the next job is the same as what it was before there. So just like with so many Apple stories and Facebook stories and Sarah Palin stories, this is all just because of the context in which it's arising. That it's worthy of some good attention here, and it's nice to draw that attention in such a provocative way.
Okay, I'll go with that. Bill, any thoughts on Twin Peaks versus Hooters versus Twin Peaks?
No, I don't think I have really much to add. Picking up on a point that Evan just made, these kinds of disputes, the way they play out, they're often really, really local. They're considerations around it that there's so much fudge factor in the argument and how they're applied. One thing I notice up here locally in Seattle is they tend to the TROs and things like that based on these kind of misappropriation or inevitable disclosure, trade secret, or violation of non-compete. They tend to be decided on kind of equitable basis. This is just sort of anecdotal. It's just something I've observed over the years. If a single person is leaving, the tendency of the judge is going to be to not restrict that person's ability to move from company to company. If 4, 5, or 6 people just so happen to move, or a whole department happens to move over the course of 2 or 3 months, the offended company is going to probably have more of a shot. So there's something kind of fungible about these doctrines in application. Maybe it's just the way the common law works. But there's a lot of room to you can't predict how these things are going to go in a given situation unless you know the facts on the ground, I think.
Oh, goodness. And Reverb Mike has thrown another wrench into this whole conundrum of the TV show Twin Peaks and whether they're going to come in and come after these guys next. Again, I think they're in a completely different realm, except for, I'm sure there were attractive women involved there too. But nobody was serving chicken wings, as far as I can recall.
Yeah, that's the best part of it.
Yes, exactly.
The chicken wings at Hooters are like the articles in Playboy.
Yep, you got to have your wings.
Well, we'll have to see if Hooters can rack up a win.
Oh, goodness gracious. We better put a stop to this. And I know of no better way of throwing water on this kind of bad pun fire than by bringing up ACTA, which I kind of thought Stephan had died away into some sort of, we've amended it and it's harmless kind of limbo. Do you want to bring us up to speed what's going on there and whether we should start paying attention to ACTA again?
Yeah, what's interesting about ACTA is it was done as a trade agreement, like instead of a treaty, which normally intellectual property agreements are done as treaties, which are negotiated out in the open, and then they have to be ratified by the Senate, of course, and implementing legislation would have to be adopted by the Congress. This was done as a trade agreement, which are normally done in secret, and I think Professor Michael Geist, acting like the legal WikiLeaks, exposed it when he had the documents leaked to him a couple of years ago. And so it's been under scrutiny since then. My understanding is the troublesome provisions of it, which basically would apply like a DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright, U.S.-style type protection around the world to prohibit counterfeiting and copyright infringement, things like this, had been watered down somewhat. So it's not as harmful as it once was. But then Obama and 3 or 4, maybe 5 or 6 other nations just signed it as in their executive capacity a couple of weeks ago. So I think there's going to be a legal question raised about whether it's actually the law in the U.S. Because it hasn't been approved by the Senate, or whether it's just an international obligation of the U.S., or even whether it's even that. As I mentioned in some emails to you, and some blog posts I'm working on about it, this calls to mind the debate in the 50s about the Bricker Amendment, right, which was based upon the concern that treaties or even executive agreements entered into by the president could supersede the Constitution and could be used to have the U.S. enter into a UN-type agreement or something else that would override the Bill of Rights, even because the language in the Constitution that says that it puts treaties up on a par with the supreme law of the land. And that amendment was defeated by one vote, although a subsequent case said that the Bill of Rights can't be superseded by treaties. But it's still a concern if the president can, just by his own authority, execute an agreement, especially because in this current environment where there's a lot of skepticism about patent abuse and copyright abuse, I'm not so sure that the Congress would have approved this law if they had to ratify the ACTA themselves.
Right. They were certainly getting a lot of heat about it from folks who learned of it through Professor Geist.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, I did have one other question about ACTA. It's kind of fled my brain. So
I've got one.
Go ahead.
If I can fill in the space here. And Stephan, how would it work out that the legality of ACTA, in as much as it was signed by the president, how would that actually come to be a dispute? Because wouldn't it require Congress to actually pass some laws that would then be enforced that people would have to sue over?
Right.
What's a possible procedural pathway for this to get challenged?
Well, as far as I can tell, most of the provisions of ACTA are already part of U.S. law. So we're basically trying to extend our more draconian provisions to the rest of the world. So I'm not sure if we are actually not already in compliance with most of ACTA in the U.S. already. But my understanding is, if you have a valid international obligation of the state under international law, usually by treaty, but sometimes by means of an executive agreement, then if you don't enact local implementing legislation, then you're just in violation of international law. And so there's no individual that's whose rights are violated who could dispute it. I think you'd have to have an interstate suit, maybe before the UN or something like that, before the UN's World Court. So probably nothing would happen realistically in the U.S. if we don't enact implementing legislation. It could have some policy decisions on the margins, but I don't think it's going to be a big effect in the U.S. as far as I understand it. In other countries, that might not be the case because their local law may have self-enforcing provisions where if they sign the agreement according to their law, then it's all automatically enforcing. I'm not really sure how Japan or the other signatories' laws would govern that.
Yeah, I wonder if we have ruled out the use of military force against Canada. I've always been intrigued by that. So,
well, in the
I'm sure
60s
Canada has too.
In the 50s and 60s and 40s and in that period of time, the U.S. did maintain the right to use military force to protect the property rights of American citizens in other countries, in particular with the the Arab oil embargoes and all the Arab oil seizures. So the Western nations have always maintained theoretically that they do have the right to use military force to enforce property rights that are being violated in other countries, and presumably that could include intellectual property if it's a property right.
Yes,
wow.
And Canada.
And Canada.
We tried to invade. We tried to invade before. I think we could get it done this time if we tried.
We did it in 1999 with the South Park movie, so I tried to work out another South Park reference there.
Blame Canada. Beatmaster, it clearly has not been paying attention enough to the folks in Hollywood and the folks who lobbied for ACTA to get enacted, because he wonders whether treaties aren't generally reserved for wars. And of course, as we all know, copyright and intellectual property violations are nothing if not a war. But I certainly hope you're wrong, Stephan, that we don't see an argument made theoretically or otherwise that military force could get behind such a thing. Bill, you've been... Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I was going to say one problem with these treaties that is often overlooked is you'll hear calls for copyright reform. Like we'll say that we need to go from an opt-out system to an opt-in system, or we need to reduce the term. But we're a member of WIPO, right? And we have international obligations that would actually prohibit us from modifying copyright law too drastically now, even if Congress were behind it. So once you enter into these international obligations, it could, under international law, prohibit needed reform of the law at a later time.
Right. Bill, you've been kind of quiet through all this, just taking it all in. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. What Stephan has been talking about, maybe is kind of this overarching extra constitutional, approach to the issues. I've been tracking, kind of down at a domestic level, Senator Leahy's Protect IP Act, and also read with interest the private agreement, the memorandum agreement between the motion picture, the MPAA, and the RIAA, and Comcast and some of the other big ISPs, which the White House wasn't a party to, but they endorsed on their blog the day it was announced or the week it was announced. I think at the legislative level and at the administrative level, there is a kind of a sanctioning of corporate vigilantism in protecting IP. The Leahy bill, for instance, and I may be the only one reading it this way, I think an earlier draft had created this safe harbor concept so that, the Justice Department was supposed to get together this blacklist of websites that were infringing, that were, not good. And there was a process set up where the Justice Department could go to a court and try to get these sites shut down and have the strip the owners of their access to their own domain names if they were infringing. And part of the law as it was first drafted said that financial transaction providers, people that facilitate financial transactions, could rely on an order or subpoena if they in good faith cooperated with or complied with the instructions of the Justice Department in dealing with these people on the bad list, that they would have this safe harbor. They wouldn't be liable to the people that would have been deprived of their property or their IP or their domain names for civil infringement. And in subsequent drafts of the bill, and I know it hasn't been passed, and legislation's a messy thing, and maybe it's an oversight, but the current form of it, the last one I looked at, that link between the safe harbor and there needing to be some action was removed, so that it now reads that if somebody that facilitates financial transactions makes a good faith determination that someone's infringing and wants to cut off services, they can do that. In the private agreement among the ISPs and the movie and radio associations, there's a system that says that if the MPAA and the RIAA put a user on a blacklist, that the ISP is going to agree to degrade service. And there's nothing about there's a system of escalation. They did a press release about how first you get a warning, and second you get educational materials, but the third or fourth step is that the ISP is supposed to start degrading the quality of the person's bandwidth before shutting them off altogether. So I don't know.
They just step on it a bit then. You can just ratchet it back, I guess. Yeah. I'll send you the link. Yeah, the idea is to slow your bandwidth to a crawl, and I guess that'll stop you from doing illegal downloads or being a copyright infringer. But it's all extrajudicial. What's in, and that's kind of strange. It's like the privatizing or the corporatizing of legal process. Right. Something we as lawyers should be concerned about. Yeah, the concern about ACTA from the get-go is exactly that. Stephan, correct me if I'm wrong. Did we talk about 3D printing with you the last time you were on the show? I know you did the great white paper on it.
I cannot remember if we talked about it last time.
We cover so much with you when you're on. But I wanted to bring it up again because just as 3D printing is starting to get really interesting and perhaps feasible in a concrete and widespread way, it appears that intellectual property is riding in to complicate things. Do you want to tell us what's going on there?
Oh, yeah. There's lots of issues that are going to start arising because of 3D printing. There's regulatory issues. I think there was a case where plans were distributed on how to assemble with a 3D printer like an essential component of like an AK-47 type submachine gun or something. Like the rest of the parts you can buy legally, but there's one part that the government heavily regulates, and you can actually fabricate it out of plastic, and it's a magazine or some part. So when people can start manufacturing objects, then a lot of the laws that now work because they're assuming the physical, the type of production process we have now are going to be easily evaded. And of course, the same thing is true with copyrighted or patented or even trademarked objects. Imagine your kid loses one of his Lego pieces, and you can buy a whole replacement set or the replacement piece for $17 or whatever, or you could just print it. And he might have one great piece as part of his set, but it would save you the hassle of having to replace the whole set. But
it would save Lego the hassle too. Just as an aside, they will actually do that. I have gone through this process. We have lost the critical piece, and Lego, if you kindly write to them and explain your sad story, will send you the new piece. And they did in our case without even charging us, which was so nice.
Oh well, I've done it a few times, and I had to pay $3.50 for a little piece that cost them 2 cents to make, but it was still cheaper than the whole set. But you could obviate the whole process by printing it yourself. And of course, things like this are going to become more and more common, just as the Motion Picture Association and the book publishers are suing people who would want to print out CDs or DVDs or books or whatever. I think that this is going to rise to a higher level, and there's already some rumbling of some threats. But the only way to stop it would be to actually outlaw information, because if you have a device in your own home, it's basically undetectable what you do with it. So if you download the plans from the internet of how to make a certain object, then you're going to have to make that illegal. And to make that illegal, you're going to have the government to have intrusive search and detection powers, monitor what you're downloading over the internet, just like they're trying to do with the help of the corporations in the case of movie and book piracy and things like this.
My head is spinning. We may have to get Beyonce on this. Evan, what do you think?
Yeah, to me, there's this fundamental shift in thinking about what it means to infringe, because we have to look at what actually happens in 3D printing. It's, making a copy, but where is the act of infringement? Where does liability attach along the pathway of getting the information to the end user so that he or she can render this thing in 3 dimensions? And I suspect that from an analytical standpoint, one would argue that the infringement would happen the moment that the plan is actually downloaded, and that you would not have to wait for the object to actually be printed for the infringement to take place. And we can get that by analogy from just plain old software license, or software copyright infringement, or even music infringement, like what Stephan was talking about, the RIAA and all of those massive efforts against piracy. By virtue of copying the information to downloading it off of the internet and putting it on a local copy, it's easier to think about it in terms of software. Say I'm going to download an application and it's infringing. It's an infringing copy. Well, I have infringed just by copying that onto my machine without actually having loaded it into RAM and executing it. The act of infringement happens sooner. So even though it's a bit problematic because we have this different aspect of rendering it in 3 dimensions, I think that the question of infringement and the liability can easily attach under frameworks of analysis that we already have long before that situation, setting aside all of these larger public policy issues as to whether or not it's a good or a bad thing to permit someone to print with a 3D printer the missing piece for an AK-47. That's a completely different issue that I don't know how to analyze at all.
Well, everyone always thinks of the guns with 3D printing. In IRC, RP Hunt, Deadpans, I assume that money is not copyrightable.
No, but forging it gets people's attention, doesn't it?
Right. Absolutely. Bill, any
guys know
3D printing thoughts?
Yeah, I read a science. I don't know what to call it. It's kind of a science fiction book. It's a book set in the near future by a guy named Charles Stross. It's called Rule 34. I want to recommend it to everybody. I think it's set in 2024, and it's kind of a crime mystery. It's about a woman who's head of a division of the internet police, and she follows what people are doing on the internet all the time, and they're looking for, in large part, crimes involving illegal downloading of information for fabricators. That's the term they use in the book. People that are building guns. And the way they police it on the ground is to outlaw the fluids or substances. Try to tightly control some of the materials that are used in weapons grade 3D printing. But part of the fun of it, the book is, he's using brand names and products that we can identify with, because it's not that far off in the future. But he's imagining just taking what is available now to some sort of extreme where it's really, really pervasive in society. Fun book.
All right. So, Bill, you found for us some bills that are still early in the House that have to do with, for one thing, crowdfunding. Some alterations to the SEC laws that look pretty interesting, and you call them kind of breathtaking. Can you tell us what we are looking at here?
Yeah, in the startup funding space, most startup companies, emerging companies, when they're raising private financing, they rely on a regulation. Most of my clients and people that are in this space rely on Rule 506 under Regulation D, and that provides the issuer with a federal exemption. It exempts you from state securities regulation, and it exempts you from the federal registration requirements, of course. Even though Rule 506 permits you to have some non-accredited, up to 35 non-accredited investors in the offering, in practice, people don't use that because that brings with it certain information requirements. So, long story short, Rule 506 under Regulation D, where an issuer is selling stock in a private offering to investors who meet the accredited investor status. That's been kind of how my whole career. That's been how startup companies raise money, from seed financing through rounds A, B, C, whatever, until there's an IPO. And there have been a number of pressure points on the structure of Regulation D. We saw it in the Dodd-Frank bill, where initially Senator Dodd wanted to increase the accredited investor standards, what it took to be an accredited investor, and studies showed that would eliminate about 2/3 of active angel investors by taking the standard way too high. So that was fought back in something called the Angel Investor Amendment last year. That was from a startup company ecosystem point of view, that was a good development. There still are, in some ways, Rule 506 is antiquated. One example is the ban on general solicitation. And the way the rule is written, it says, an offering that is relying on this exemption can't use radio, TV advertisements, public meetings that are advertised, broadcasts, and the language of that regulation is pretty 20th century, and people in the securities bar like myself, we all sort of acknowledge it's kind of observed in the breach, because with Twitter and social media and chat rooms, and then angel groups that have meetings that are tweeted about and that are, there's a lot of chatter on the web about them, it's arguable that a lot of people are not following the general solicitation rule. That's been something that a lot of people in the bar have thought, there should be a reform.
So the quiet period is now full of din and chatter, is what you're telling me?
One of the legislatures, yeah. Well, this isn't. It doesn't have to do with IPOs or companies that are going public. It just has to do with whether you're. I guess from an SEC perspective, you might say, is one of the indicia of a truly private offering that is not a public offering. It's a private transaction, so the offering doesn't need to be registered with the SEC. Among the indicia are, in raising the money, you're just dealing with people that you have a prior business relationship with, and you're not out there advertising. Well,
all right. So that's how we get to crowdfunding. People you don't know.
Yeah. It's related. There's a separate bill for eliminating general solicitation that would open the field, that make Angel List a bit more comfortable about what they're doing, I think, because they've always been right on that edge. The crowdfunding is a kind of a populist concept that why should it just be a rich person's game? Why do you have to be a millionaire or have a high income in order to invest in startup companies? So the crowdfunding concept, and that's been pushed by phenomenon like Kickstarter, as the cost of starting particularly IT or software or internet-oriented companies has gone down because the resources are more available, and companies can make a go of something by raising a few $100,000 instead of a few million. The idea has been, why can't we just kind of pass the hat, get small donations from people, and why can't that be okay? The SEC has toyed with the idea. The commissioner said earlier this year that the SEC would look at it, but House Republicans have just kind of bypassed her with a bill that's breathtaking in the sense that it creates this new exemption that's beyond, I think, what even initial proponents of crowdfunding had requested, saying that companies can raise up to $5 million as long as they don't take more than $10,000 per person. And that investment doesn't represent more than 10% of that person's net worth. So it's kind of a small investor rights act, you might say. Yeah. That the government shouldn't stand in the way of normal people or non-rich people investing in startup companies, and entrepreneurs shouldn't have impediments to not being able to take money from willing investors to get stuff going. So,
right.
So
I guess we should back up for a second and just tell people who are not terribly familiar with the securities laws that the SEC has these protections in place for the common man and woman, you and I and everyone else, who aren't big, deep-pocketed institutions or very wealthy individuals, that the SEC thinks that we need to be taken care of, and that we don't, give our money away in fraudulent schemes to people who are just out there trying to take it and not trying to establish a legitimate company. They're just, taking the money and run. What was the great movie about the play that was the failure? Where they took all the
that was the producers.
The producers, yes. So it's really the protection against getting sucked into the producers. And so it sounds like this law is trying to back off that a bit, but it also sounds like it has a long way to go. Stephan, what do you think about this?
Let me ask Bill one clarifying thing. Did you say that it would also raise the number from 500 to some higher number, or was that what you just described?
It's a suite of different bills. There may be 5 or 6 of them, and that's a discrete bill, and that's something that I think the secondary trading, the private secondary markets in California are trying to get across, because and companies like Facebook that kind of back into becoming public companies because they have so many shareholders.
Right.
So that's gonna raise the number of shareholder threshold from 500 to 1,000. That's the proposal.
Yeah, my understanding is that was around 300 a couple years ago, or it was a lower number about 4 or 5 years ago, I think. They raised it a few years ago.
It's going to go to 1,000.
Okay.
And what's more, there are amendments going back and forth, but I believe they're going to not include in the count employees or former employees of the company who presumably become shareholders by virtue of exercising stock options. I believe that particular bill probably has legs. I believe that got unanimous support from both parties. Some of the ones that have more direct investor protection implications are probably going to be more partisan.
They sound generally positive to me. I think what's happened is you'll have a private startup company, like I'm a general counsel for one of these companies, and they'll go through a couple of rounds of financing and they'll acquire a number of investors. And because of the economic downturn, some of these companies are not going public yet, so they're going through further and further rounds of fundraising. And every time they do this, they may acquire more shareholders. And you do have to count the employees who have stock options, is my understanding. So the 300 number was raised to 500 a few years ago, but even the 500 number is probably being approached by a growing number of companies, partly because of the downturn. So I think that excluding employees from the definition and raising it to 1,000 would be good, as would the angel investor rule that you mentioned, although that could cause some distortions in how you raise money if no one can give more than 10,000 within a certain segment of your investors. But they sound generally positive to me.
Yep.
Yeah, and in the 500 shareholder rule, people that the crowdfunding bill as written today says that people that become investors under the crowdfunding exemption don't get counted in the 1,000 shareholder limit. I agree with your analysis. I think another factor in it too is the growth of these secondary markets. That's also a function of the IPO market being weak and it taking longer to monetize with an investment. And a lot of the hot social media and other startup companies, the founders get substantial liquidity without having a exit event, and sometimes early investors cash out entirely through these secondary markets, and that kind of amplifies things as founders and insiders and early investors sell maybe not their entire equity in the company, but portions of it. So the initial shareholdings kind of get parceled out as the value of the company goes up. People want to take some money off the table, but not all their upside off the table.
Bill, you mentioned this law was partially in response to things like Kickstarter. Is Kickstarter functioning in some loophole in existing law at the moment? How is it? Sorry, go ahead. Great question. Kickstarter's terms of service are very interesting because they are aware that under the Howell test, a promise of financial return on the money you contribute to somebody's project or idea would make that contribution a security, whatever you would call it. If there was going to be some return on the money given, that would make it a security, and they'd be afoul of SEC rules. So there are terms of service that make it very clear you may not offer any kind of financial return or financial incentive. You have to give instead a copy of the prototype or a T-shirt or some other fun incentive. It reminds me almost of the gift you get from public radio when you pledge. You get something to incentivize you to do it, but you can't get a security. If the crowdfunding bill, something like it, were to pass, that would make it okay on Kickstarter to say among the things you can give away is a share in the ownership of the company. Right. Well, this is a lead-in then to one of our resources of the week, because there is an opportunity to comment on this proposed legislation as it is wending its way through the House. Bill, where should people go and what should they do when they get there?
This is and I'm not being partisan about this. It's just I just want people to be aware if they go to the site. It's the House Financial Services Committee. It's the official government website of the House Financial Services Committee, and what you'll see is a link to the it's HTTP.
Oh, that's okay. We'll put it in. We'll put it in the discussion points for the show at delicious.com/thisweekinlaw/133. It's already there, actually, and we're showing it on the screen now.
Okay, yeah, it's not hard to read these bills, unlike so many of the others in the IP spaces we've been talking about. Most of these bills are just a page or two long. And they've already been passed by a subcommittee, and they'll be taken by which is why I'm taking them seriously, because they have some traction. One or two of them got bipartisan support, and some of them are making it through just on Republican votes. But I was struck that there's so much talk about Startup America and a startup friendly, entrepreneur friendly agenda. It just struck me as odd that there are no comments. That could be that there are no comments because whoever's on the other side of this comment form is not approving them and publishing them. So I don't know. But I would think this would be an opportunity to read the bill and ask questions about it, or put their 2 cents in about it.
Yeah, and I think we have a lot of listeners who are in the startup space and would be very interested in what happens here with this pending legislation. So thanks for bringing that. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, we can make bird puns all day, but when he says put their 2 cents in, nobody picks up on that.
Absolutely.
Put their 10,000 in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, at maximum. The other resource I want to highlight for people, because, you really need to know what usufruct means, I think, if you don't already. Stephan's going to take care of you, because he has published a new book called A Dictionary of Civil Law Terminology in Louisiana. Usufruct and naked owners are explained to common lawyers and civilians. And thank goodness for that, Stephan. You've done a real public service here.
It was a labor of love.
You better tell us what those two terms mean, so we don't leave people hanging.
Oh, usufruct is just the right to use something and get the fruits, the civil fruits. It's like a life estate in common law.
Mm-hmm.
Was the other naked owner? Was the other? That's like the remainder man, the guy that owns the base of the property that it reverts to upon the death of the usufructuary.
That's right. And so anybody who is interested in arcane terms of law in the state of Louisiana can go to quidprolaw.com and look up Stephan's book and lay your nice little hands on it. Now, somebody who laid their hands on something that he probably shouldn't have is Richmond, Virginia lawyer D. Wayne O'Brien. And our tip of the week is about him because he's a personal injury lawyer, and he decided to get involved in some of these mass suits against alleged P2P infringers. And his case went hopefully wrong in front of a federal judge. And he ultimately got sanctioned for running a shakedown against the anonymous defendants. And I think if you're a personal injury lawyer, there are probably many other reasons to criticize the lawyers who bring these kinds of cases. But, jumping into full-on IP assault when your background is PI, I think is probably a pretty silly thing to do. Evan, did you have any thoughts on Mr. D. Wayne O'Brien?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't know him and don't know anything more about him than what I've read in this article. This description, even though it's from Ars Technica and Nate Anderson, he writes some really scathing pieces when it comes to attacking this business model of plaintiffs' lawyers filing lawsuits against thousands of unknown, anonymous P2P BitTorrent using alleged copyright infringers. He writes some pretty scathing pieces on that. I don't really see what Mr. O'Brien did wrong other than making the fundamental choice at the beginning to take a case like this and to file the lawsuit. It's not like he did something as terrible as what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago with lawyer Evan Stone down in Texas, who was sending subpoenas when the court actually had not granted leave to send these subpoenas. So what we get from this story is that the judge apparently didn't take too kindly to these kinds of suits at a very fundamental level, regardless of the lawyering that Mr. O'Brien did. I'm saying it this way just because I don't want to criticize Mr. O'Brien's lawyering without seeing any indication that he actually did something wrong here. What this does for us is say that these lawsuits perhaps are, I'll just go ahead and say, I'll strike the word perhaps. This judge seemed to think that these lawsuits are pretty silly.
There we go. All right, so that's our tip for this week, and I think that's our show. I really appreciate you guys being with us today. It's been a really interesting show. We've covered a lot of ground and a lot of puns, unfortunately, but we hope you'll forgive us for that. We try and cover a lot of ground and fewer puns than this show generally on our show every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, 1800 UTC. And we hope that you'll join us when we record the show live, because we love to have a live audience that joins us in chat at irc.twit.tv. You can watch the show live at just go to twit.tv. That's where you're going to see it. And if you go to twit.tv/TWiL, you'll see our whole archive of shows going back quite a long way, almost 5 years. In fact, we're going to celebrate the 5th anniversary of This Week in Law next week. So we look forward to that too. We hope you'll join us. And in the meantime, I'd like to really thank once again our excellent panel, Stephan, Kinsella. We love having you on the show. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, Denise. Enjoyed it.
It's been a real pleasure. Of course, please do go check out Stephan's writings and doings when he's not joining us here on TWiL. He's very active on Google+, and you can find him at stephankinsella.com. He is NS Kinsella on Twitter. And anything else you'd like to plug or draw people's attention to before we go?
One nice resource I was looking at this morning is the Mises website's wiki. They have an excellent page. It's wiki.mises.org. They have an excellent page on, it's called Without Intellectual Property, and you can find it from their intellectual property page. But it's got like a summary or a compendium of various ways people are finding to profit that doesn't rely upon intellectual property. So that's a nice resource.
And that's MISES, correct?
Yeah, wiki.mises.org.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. We hope to have you on again soon.
Thank you.
And joining us once again was Bill Carleton. Bill, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts on your journey to New York. That was really enlightening, and all your other insights.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Denise. Thanks a lot for having me back. I've really enjoyed it. Really appreciate it.
And for anyone who's been watching the video of the show, I think we've definitively worked out that that is not an open medicine cabinet behind Bill, but actually a poster of one.
Yeah, that's right. It's a high digital. It's very, very high resolution. You walk up to it, you can almost walk into it.
We could tell. I think that Colin in the studio actually had to make sure we were getting the reflection on it so that people did not think they were peering right into your medicine cabinet, which we thought for a while.
The artist's name is Isaac Lehman, and he's going to have a show, retrospective at the tender young age of 20-something at the Fry Art Museum in Seattle in November.
Cool. All right. Well, you have the world's greatest online handle. I think it's really, more your profession is ill-chosen because you go around online as Wax6. And I think maybe, you should partner up with Beyonce, because it sounds like you should really be doing something in the entertainment industry with that one. But Wax6 on Twitter, wax6.com. Anything else that you want to, that of course is your initials, I take it.
That is my first email address, issued by Cornell University to me in 1985, I think maybe it was, or 86. So, and I've just kept it.
There you go. It serves you well. Anything else you want to bring people's attention to before we go?
A blog that's really hot right now that I'm really enjoying a lot is Dave Weiner's blog, scriptingnews.com, I think, or maybe it's scriptingnews.org. Dave Weiner, the originator of RSS feeds and other things, and he's pulling together a lot of this public-private ownership of IP and trying to make sense of the Occupy Wall Street movement and all that. I mean, half the issues we talked about today, he's entertaining from a technology and a policy perspective. So I just recommended that. He's really in good form right now.
Oh, that's so great. Thank you so much for bringing up Dave. He does an excellent job of that and has for, the last decade or more of bringing together all kinds of thoughts and perspectives and bits of news. And that's I think, how we're all here, because Dave started doing this and we all started doing it in his wake. So I'm glad to hear you say that he is still doing a great job of what I've always enjoyed from him. So thanks for that. And Evan, wonderful to chat with you again this week. Had a great talk.
I did too, and I have to admit I was a little stressed out preparing for this show because they got some really smart guys on this show, so I had to really do my homework and be up to be up for the task. But it was a wonderful time as usual. Really appreciate you having me on, and really looking forward to the next go round.
I know. Well, you see, I try and staff us up with really smart people on the panel, so you and I can just kind of lean back and listen and take it all in and enjoy their wonderful perspectives and chime in with puns when we feel the urge.
Right. That kind of just makes it easier.
That's right.
Glad I can help you out with that.
Yes, absolutely. And we really appreciate all of you joining us for This Week in Law. When you tune back in next Thursday, you'll have Windows Weekly with Paul Thurrott, and we'll be back at our Friday time slot. And with that, we will sign off and ask you to, if you're watching live, stay tuned for iPad Today coming up in about half an hour. Thanks, everyone. Take care.